Let me say hello to all of you again. My name is Kyle. This is Uplift. I'm so glad that you're here. We're starting a brand new series here in Uplift called Hope. That's just the name of this series. And I think you know why. Because the world feels extremely chaotic. It feels extremely out of control. If your neighborhood is like mine, you live in a neighborhood where your neighbors have yard signs for politicians declaring their allegiances, making the streets where we live boundaries that we're really no longer invited to cross anymore. We see daily horrific repercussions from apocalyptic weather events. There's one happening now. We have family members that live in Tampa, and we're very aware of the impending hurricane. We are experiencing historic inflation. It's caused a lot of our families to make some hard choices about family budgets and about how to pay for just basic items. We are in epidemics of anxiety and depression, and credit card debt is at historically high levels, and we feel that these pressures and these stressors, they just feel like they're not going to end, like we don't find any relief. I think we need some hope. And that's the reason for this series. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a macro look at hope over the next few weeks. And to be honest, between me and you, my plan is to carry this series through Election Day. That's kind of the point. Because right now, hope is in really short supply. And let me just kind of say this as a disclaimer, whether we like it or not, our hope is not dependent on who wins in our next presidential election. We're told it should be, but it's not. Our hope is in Jesus, and I want us to remember that. So we're going to start our series on hope by talking about bookends. Let's talk about bookends, and not the kind that prop up books on your bookshelf. We're talking about narrative bookends, the storytelling kind that wraps tales and stories in neat packages, because I'm sure you've noticed in some of your favorite movies or books that these good stories just know how to start and how to end, like they've been choreographed with the precision of a ballet. Let's think about a couple of those. Let's start with the 1942 classic movie Casablanca. The movie begins with Rick Blaine. He's running his nightclub. He's indifferent to the world war around him, and ends in the same place, but it ends with Rick being transformed after sacrificing his personal happiness for a greater cause. He sends Ilsa on her way on that famous foggy runway. That's a bookend. It brings the story full circle. It ties up the emotional knot, compelling or completing the quest of the main character. Let's take a couple of others. The 1972 movie, The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola's mafia epic, opens and closes in the same setting, Don Vito Corleone's office. The film begins with the wedding of Don Vito's daughter. He sits in the office. He's granting favors because he's the patriarch. But by the end of the movie, it's a spoiler alert. It's his son, Michael, who's the Don, who assumes the same position of power in that very infamous scene where he closes the door to the same office because he's the new Godfather. Another, it's a classic book, The Hobbit, by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you've ever read that, Bilbo Baggins, he's the Hobbit. He starts his journey in his cozy hobbit hole in the Shire. He lives a quiet and unassuming life, but he's swept up in an epic adventure of dragons and dwarves and wizards. And after the end of all this, he returns home to the Shire, and he's a changed hobbit. You never thought you'd hear that in a sermon before, right? A changed hobbit. He's acquired not only treasure, but wisdom and courage. These are bookends, and great bookends give us a beginning and an ending that mirror each other, that frame the chaos in between with comforting symmetry. They don't just finish the story, they complete it. Now, I want us to think about bookends as we talk about the Bible for a minute, because this is where we find our macro view of hope. Let's give you some statistics about the Bible. The Bible's not really just a book. It's a collection of books. You might know this. It's a symphony. It's composed of 66 movements, 66 books written across 1,600 years by 40 different authors. These were prophets and poets, kings and prisoners, doctors and lawyers, they scribbled on parchment in caves and in palaces and prisons on 3 different continents, writing these books in 3 different languages. Yet somehow, by the Spirit of God, their words harmonize into one great resonant story. And despite the vast range of time and place, each author contributed to one single story. It's the story of God. It's the story of redemption, and it has its own bookend. So if you look closely, if you read Scripture, you're going to see a master at work, framing the story in perfection with beginnings and endings that meet in the most profound of ways. Let me show you a few of these. In the first few pages of the book of Genesis, it's the very first book of the Bible, we see the world created. It's formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovers over the waters. There's darkness and there's uncertainty. By the time we reach the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, we have a new heavens and a new earth. There is no sea. There's no symbol of chaos or danger. The world is ordered. It's peaceful, and there's no need for the sun or the moon because the light of Jesus is enough, and his presence illuminates creation. Let's go back to Genesis. In Genesis, God walks in the garden with 2 people, with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. It's an intimate picture of God near his creation. But in Revelation, that scene swells to a grand crescendo. It's not just 2 people anymore, but it's multitudes. It's every nation, every tongue, every tribe redeemed. They're standing in the presence of God. In Genesis, Eve is given over in marriage to Adam, or as the New Testament writers call them, the first Adam. But in Revelation, it's the church who marries Christ, who's referred to by the same New Testament writers as the last Adam. And the scene of that wedding is unbelievable. It's delectable. The bookends continue. The serpent enters the garden in the 3rd chapter of Genesis as an antagonist. But in the 20th chapter of Revelation, the serpent is bound and tossed into the lake of fire. In Genesis, humanity's sin curses the earth, but by Revelation, that curse is lifted like it never happened. In Genesis, the tree of life is forbidden. Its fruit is guarded, but in the final pages of Revelation, the tree of life stands open and available for the healing of the nations. Cursed ground in Genesis is replaced by a world where every curse is lifted in Revelation. God is resting again with his people as he intended in Genesis until the interruption of sin. But this time in Revelation, the rest is eternal and sin can't ever interrupt it again. You see the beauty in these bookends. Powerful. The elegance there and the precision. God's story is not just a collection of ancient writings. It's one continuous narrative unfolding from Genesis to Revelation. Every thread is pulled tight. Every loose end is tied up. No cliffhangers in this story. It's extraordinary. It's majestic. It's a deeply interconnected narrative weaving through the ages. And everything changes in this story. Empires crumble. Kings rise and fall. The earth itself shifts and groans. We get earthquakes and plagues and famines. We get apocalyptic events. People live and people die, but through all of it, God is constant. He's present at the beginning and he's still reigning at the end, unmoved and unchanging. He's the anchor of the universe in the storm of history, holding steady while everything else spirals. By the way, if you need some clarity on this, I want you to see Jesus' words in Revelation chapter 22. You know these. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. This is a profound truth about who Jesus is. From the first letter to the last, Jesus encompasses all of history. all of creation. In this grand story, Jesus is the first word spoken, and he's the final punctuation. And if you missed it, just read it again. Let it sink in. Jesus is the ultimate bookend. He connects. It's Jesus who connects the narrative from Genesis to Revelation, from creation to new creation. And I just have to ask, don't you want to know him? Don't you want to know him? But Jesus is not only the bookend, he's the heart of the story. He's the macro view of hope, and he's the micro view of hope. He's the centerpiece. He's in the in-between. It's not just luck or chance or fate that moves us from the Garden of Eden to the New Jerusalem. We're brought there because the creator of all things stepped into time and became creation, who became a human. And it's because of one night in another garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus submitted to the Father's will and bore the cross, that we can move from paradise lost to paradise restored. And the tree of life, once off limits, is now wide open because of another tree, the one called Calvary, where Jesus died in our place and took the punishment for sin that was ours. So let's pause just for a minute and consider this Jesus, the unchanging, the Alpha and the Omega, standing firm as the world shakes. Jesus is the bookend in this sweeping, all-encompassing story. Jesus remains faithful, and he's true from the beginning to the end and through everything in between. It's a story worth celebrating. It's a story of hope. It's a story of hope, and we need hope. So over the next few weeks, we're going to look at these profound bookends of God's narrative, this macro view of hope and the micro view of hope from both Genesis and Revelation. Now, let's just have a little disclaimer. Those two books are arguably the most debated books in the entire Bible, not just among scholars and theologians, but at your family dinner table, on social media, among believers and non-believers. And you know why? You know why? Because we like asking modern questions about ancient texts. But here's my challenge. Instead of obsessing over timelines and cosmic clocks, I want us to focus on who the story's about and what God is doing in the story. I think that's important. And what God does in these stories is filled with hope. It begins with hope and it ends with hope, even in the in-between. In fact, I want us to consider how the first 4 words of the book of Genesis set the tone for everything that follows. You know this: in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. This story is ultimately about God. And in the book of Revelation, the opening lines read, the revelation of Jesus Christ. Both of these books reveal not just a timeline of events, but rather an unfolding narrative about God's hopeful purpose throughout history. So as we embark on this exploration, I have to give you another disclaimer. It's very critical and crucial to remember that the Bible wasn't necessarily written to us. It was written for us, and that's important. These texts were addressed to specific people in particular times and cultures. What I want us to do is I want us to understand how the original and intended audiences perceived God's story. And by doing that, we can better grasp what God is communicating to us. So I want us to open our hearts and our minds to this rich tapestry of Revelation. So we got to ask a couple of questions, a little more specific. And the first one is, why Genesis? Why Genesis? Well, let's talk about Genesis for a minute. I want us to consider for a minute who God addresses in the book of Genesis. Most scholars agree that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Bible. Even Jesus affirmed that Moses crafted these books, but who needed to read these books when they were first written, and why did they need it? Well, here's the answer. A little bit of biblical history and some of the biblical story. It's Moses who led the Israelites out of 400 years of brutal slavery in Egypt. And after crossing the Red Sea, they wandered the wilderness and they grappled with suffering and questions that we know all too well. You know these questions. You've asked them. How do we end up here? What's going on? What's God doing right here in this moment? Is Yahweh, the Hebrew name for God, is he truly greater than the gods of Egypt, the nation we just left? Those are big questions. And as generations of Israelites and Hebrews faded, the living memory of their spoken traditions also dimmed, and the Hebrew people needed some answers. So Genesis was written to remind the Israelites of their origins and to clarify who God is in their turmoil. Unlike the chaotic creation myths of the surrounding nations, which depicted a world that was born from violent conflict, Genesis tells a very different tale. That God is the creator and he made humanity out of his desire for fellowship and not servitude. Let me tell you what John Walton, he's a theology professor at Wheaton College. This is what he says about Genesis. He frames Genesis as a home story, And it's a book, he says, that explores how the world became a home, a sanctuary for humanity. So let me kind of give you, for instance, define it a different way. So when someone asks you about your house, you don't really share with them blueprints. You talk about how your house became your home. The Hebrew people didn't need a scientific breakdown of the universe. They needed to understand how God prepared the world for them, because the Hebrew people, they're wandering in the wilderness and they're later wandering in exile. For them, Genesis wasn't about dissecting the scientific underpinnings of the universe. It was about understanding how God created this world for them. And they needed to grasp how he ordered it and prepared it to be their home. And this is precisely what Genesis lays out. It's not revealing a house, but a sanctuary, a home, and it's meticulously designed for humanity. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, you know this, we see the unfolding of creation. We just read it. It opens with the summary of what God does in the very beginning. He creates the heavens and the earth. But in the very next verse, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, it paints a very different picture. It paints a picture of chaos. The earth is formless and void, and it's shrouded in darkness before God brings order to this creation. So over the first 3 days of that creation, God shapes the world. And on days 4 through 6, he fills it. And especially in verse 6, after he fills the land with every other living creature, he creates humanity. And he does so in his own image as representatives, tasked with stewardship over this beautifully ordered and crafted world. So as the Hebrews read this account in exile, in their wandering, they're going to be struck by the power of Yahweh, who just spoke and light appeared. This God was there from the beginning, and he was actively shaping their existence. And before any creature took a breath, God had already provided for their needs. He created skies for birds and ocean for fish and land for crops and vegetation. You got to think about these people. It took them, the Hebrews, 40 years to travel to their promised land in a journey that should only have taken a couple of weeks. And they questioned if they would ever find their way home. And later in their history, when they were ripped again from their promised home to become exiles again in another empire, Genesis would continue to remind them that God crafted this world with them in mind. He had already faithfully provided their provisions long before they even needed it. Again, this narrative wasn't meant to be debated endlessly. It was designed to instill trust and awe in the God of creation. And here's kind of where it comes for us, right? Because we have some chaotic moments. Our lives feel very formless and void sometimes. In Genesis, for us, gives us the opportunity to recognize the active presence of God from the very beginning of everything. It tells us that we can trust his ongoing provision and his power. It's this timeless reminder that the world is not just the backdrop for our lives. It's a home crafted with divine intention. That's the beginning of the story. But what about the end? So the next question here is, why Revelation? What's going on with this book? Well, let's first of all admit that Revelation has some frightening images, right? Horror movie type stuff. It's fueled a lot of conspiracy theories, but Revelation wasn't written to frighten people. It wasn't written to frighten the people that it was intended for, and it's not written to scare us. It's actually meant to comfort. It's meant to close the story of human history with a sense of hope and resolution. Revelation was written to inject courage into the church then and now. But what we've done is we've turned it into a swirling storm of confusion and controversy. And we've done so we've done this and we've missed the point. The message of Revelation is clear: to stand firm. Be hopeful because God is in control. Let's talk about the writer. John the Apostle wrote Revelation around 96 AD. And by that time, the early church had suffered through 3 decades of brutal persecution. Let me give you a little bit of it. In 64 AD, the Roman emperor Nero, infamous for his cruelty, burned Jesus' followers like human torches, and he did it just to light his gardens. During this wave of terror, both Peter and Paul were executed. 6 years later, Rome destroyed Jerusalem under the leadership of the Roman Emperor Vespasian. The temple was burned to the ground. I want you to imagine what that did to the believers across the Roman Empire. Everything they held sacred was reduced to ash. A little bit later, the Roman Emperor Domitian brought Rome's cruelty to new heights. He demanded that every Roman citizen worship him as God. Everyone had to burn incense to him in the public square, and they had to declare that Caesar is Lord. If you refuse, you faced 4 brutal options: imprisonment, confiscation of property, banishment, or death. And you know who refused? It was John. John refused to do this. And he was banished to the island of Patmos because of it. And it was into this climate that the book of Revelation was written. And it was delivered to 7 churches who endured suffering under Domitian. I want you to look specifically at what John wrote to the church in Smyrna. It's one of the 7 churches in Revelation. He quotes Jesus here. Look at this. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you're rich. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Persecution, by the time John wrote this, had been felt by all generations and demographics of believers. Younger believers knew that they could be impoverished or imprisoned for following Jesus, or even fed to the lions. And older believers had come to see suffering as this bitter old friend, but they all found Jesus worth their devotion, worth the risk, and worth their very lives. I want you after giving you some context, I want us to consider these bookends, to consider Genesis and Revelation. Both of these books were written for people facing extraordinary hardship. Yet God's message in both was the same, and it is simple. And it's this: trust me. The people in Genesis, they were asking, how did we get here? Where's God in all this? The people in Revelation asked, where are we headed? And can we trust God to bring us through? You and I know these questions. We get it. We ask them. We probably asked them this morning when we prayed. How do we get here, Lord? Are we going to make it? Are we going to make it? God's answer comes not just in words, but in the form of the stories that he provides. In Genesis, he shows himself as the God of creation who brings order out of chaos. And in Revelation, he's the God of consummation, the one who brings all things to their rightful end. But the people reading those stories, they're caught in the middle. They're caught in the in-between. They know how it started, and they're promised a hopeful conclusion, but they're living through the tough, messy middle. And look, you and I are there too. We find ourselves in the in-between. We live in a world that feels completely unhinged. It's marked by chaos. It's marked by injustice. It's marked by heartache. And it's easy to feel like we're just stuck in the middle of a story that doesn't make sense. But our forgetfulness does not define our reality. Listen carefully. God is not just at the beginning, and he's not just at the end. He's here right now. In fact, John writes to the 7 churches that Jesus walked among those churches. What an amazing image that they are not alone. Jesus is not aloof. He's with them. When they share communion, when they worship and sing, and when they pray, Jesus walks. He walks among them. He's with us. He's in the middle with us. He's in the in-between with us, as he was with all of his followers. Let me give you a few examples, few of these examples. He gave his name to Moses at the burning bush as I am. Not I was, nor was it I will be. I am, when Moses questioned his own future. He stood in the flames and the fires with Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego when they honored God, even if it meant their deaths. He stood there with them. He urged Jeremiah to buy a field as a sign in a war-torn country that God's people would one day come back from exile. And he spoke to a young unmarried girl in occupied Palestine that she would give birth to his one and only son. He stood before a dying and murdered Stephen as Jesus exalted in heaven. And all of these stories from all these people who had the same questions that we have, God was there at every one of them. He is present in the in-between. He's the hope in the darkness. And the story of our world and the story of our lives, listen, they're not stories of despair. Even if they feel formless and void and dark, our lives are stories of hope. The gospel of Jesus is not one of defeat. Y'all, it's one of victory, because God is with us in the now as he was with us then and as he will be with us in the future. And if we can trust God with the grand story of creation and consummation, then we can trust him with the middle. We can trust him. And even when we can't trace God's hand, we can trust his heart. The God of the beginning and the God of the end is also the God of the in-between. So as we move forward together, I want us to open our eyes and our hearts to see him at work, even in the hardest parts of our story. And let me just say this as we kind of wrap this up. If you're feeling weary, if you're ready to give up, I want you to know something. God is not finished yet. The reality is that the in-between may be tough, but we know where we're headed, and we know how the story ends. Praise the Lord for that.